Okay, so I have 12:30, so I'm gonna start now. Welcome everybody to the kind of widely sponsored webinar, a new era of publishing, open access, digitalisation and political science. I'm Lizzie Brophy. I'm a journals publisher at Wiley, focusing on the European political science portfolio. Here with me today are three great speakers. I've got Paul Trevorrow, who is an executive journal editor at Wiley, Emiliano Grossman, who is one of the editors of the European Journal of Political Research, and Orla Muldoon, who is one of the editors for political psychology. So they'll be talking today about open access and digitalisation. And each one of them will take a turn to talk through this. We will have a bit of a discussion in between each one, and then hopefully questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. This session is being recorded, though everybody who is joining us as a participant will not be able to speak, so don't worry about that. Without further ado then, I will pass over to Paul, who will be able to start us on this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to present today. So my name is Paul Trevorrow. I'm Executive Journals Editor at Wiley. I've been working in journal publishing for 18 years, and although political science isn't my field, I hope today's presentation will offer some insights into the developments in your arena, together with some of the broader changes happening in publishing in general. So the agenda for today, I will look at publication trends in the political science field and delve then into the evolution and adoption of open access in that context. Then we're going to delve down a little bit further into open research and open access in the broader publishing context. And to top it off, we'll drill down into the Wiley Project Deal Agreement as one of the great case studies in the advent of transitional agreements. So to kick off the meeting, I wanted to add some clarity to some of the publishing terms used in this presentation. I think as publishers and editors, we can sometimes assume that everyone knows our vernacular, and I apologise if some of this is obvious, but adding clarity from the start will help in everyone's understanding of the presentation. So first off, Gold OA, what is it? Gold Open Access is the publication model whereby article processing fees, or APCs, is typically paid by the author, institution or funder for open access. It's usually associated with a Creative Commons license, which grants copyright to the author and has a variation of reuse options depending on the type of CC license that's attributed to it. And then we have green open access. These are typically articles available through self-archiving or available after an embargo period on the final manuscript, slightly different to Gold OA, which has an APC fee. And there's Bronze OA, and these are articles that are made freely available by the publisher, but they may not have a Creative Commons license. So there are subtle differences between these open access models. A hybrid journal is a journal that publishes both subscription articles and Gold Open Access articles. And we'll talk a little bit here about transitional agreements. There are many variations on what a transitional agreement is, but at its heart are essentially new publication models that tend to move beyond traditional subscription-based reading and towards open access. Now, the JCR and Web of Science are publication databases maintained by Clarivate Analytics, and these give access to bibliometric data and impact factors, and we may use these acronyms as we go forward, so just so you know what they are. So here's an example of some key titles and societies in which we partner in this arena. We have 38 titles here. They're all hybrid titles with the exception of one journal, the Asia and Pacific Policy Studies, which is pure Gold OA. And of these 38 titles, 32 are society owned. So that's enough about us. Let's talk about a little bit about you. But before I do, I have to express some caveats. The following data are curated from Clarivate's JCR and Web of Science databases. Now, these databases have different criteria for indexing than other bibliometric databases. So, for example, the counting that we're going to do here may be different to Scopus or Dimensions or Google Scholar, for example. And so counting these databases may be different to systems that you have available to the community. So this graph illustrates the number of journals indexed in the JCR political science category. What is notable, I think, here is that over this 20-year history, the number of journals indexed in the category has more than doubled, with considerable growth taking place between 2006 and 2012. We can see in 2000, there were 80 index titles. Move forward to 2019, we've got 180. That's a growth of 100 new journals in this category in 20 years. In terms of article output, we see a general trend of growth between the periods 2001 and 2008, followed by a plateauing period with renewed growth in 2019. Over the past 5 years, we've witnessed growth in the proportion of gold open access in the category from 4% in 2015 to 9% in 2019. But if one were also to consider the green and bronze open access components, we talked about those in the glossary, it would equate to around 21% of material in 2019 would be openly available in one model or another, that be that gold, bronze, or green. So a fifth of material in the category in 2019 has some open access component to it. So if we look at the output by country in this category, by the top 20 most prolific countries, you see that the US is the largest producer of content, followed by the UK, Germany, Canada, and so forth. The blue sections represent the number of gold open access articles published from that category, from that territory. Now, this graph shows the top 20 most prolific countries and their proportion of gold open access versus subscription article. What this slide tries to demonstrate is that there are different open access behaviours between territories, and we'll discuss some of those trends in a bit more detail in a later slide. So that's how the field looks like from a broad bibliometric point of view. And I'd like to talk a little bit now on what is happening in the rapidly changing face of publishing, in particular open research. And within that, open access is an important component. So here's a definition of open research by the European Commission. I won't read it out to you, but in short, open research is very much driven by new digital tools that can enable greater democracy, accessibility, transparency, collaboration, and verification in research. And at its core are 5 tenets. So there's open access, where research is accessible without a subscription paywall. There's open data, where the data underlying the research findings are made available for verification and potentially expansion by others. Journals are increasingly being encouraged to engage with data and the level to which authors' data is available. And here we have a scale from encourages to mandates data, under which many journals operate. I know there are at least 5 Wiley journals in the political science arena that range from between expects to requires data. We move on to open practices. These are practices that give greater transparency to the publication process. I think a great example of this is transparent peer review, where the peer review reports of an accepted manuscript are made available for all to read. And then there's open collaboration. Some examples here would be author portals and notebooks, which all empower researchers to collaborate in greater diversity and inclusivity. And then we have open recognition and reward. I mean, there are lots of examples to use here. The one I would like to highlight in relation to peer review is Publons, which creates a system of recognition for peer reviewers. There's also Wiley's open research badges, and I think EJPR and SPSR have these that enable researchers to gain recognition for engaging with transparent practices such as data sharing and registered reports. So what's the benefits of this movement? Well, increased openness. It's making the whole entire scientific publishing process more open and granting better access points for research. There's increased reproducibility, as exampled in the previous examples with open data initiatives, making data available for potential verification. And then there's increased accountability, as we've seen with the open data and transparent peer review initiatives. These function on improving the transparency and the integrity of the research. So now let's delve a little bit deeper into the open access component of the open research movement. This is an area that's seen rapid and dynamic change over the past few decades, especially in my past 18 years in publishing. This is an area that has grown exponentially. Open access is often described as an overnight revolution, but it's been 20 years in the making, actually. And I'm going to give you a very potted history. So in the year 2000, open access as we sort of know it today starts to appear. We have PubMed Central, which was founded as a repository for open access content. And then to meet the needs of open access advocates in the life sciences, Biomed Central becomes the first commercial born open access publisher. By 2002, PLOS is founded and funded, and Howard Hughes is the first funder to commit to paying article processing charges. And at this point in 2002, Biomed Central begins to charge article processing fees. And thus the gold open access business model was really born here. By 2006, policies and recommendations start to gather steam among private and government funders. Larger publishers start responding to this by launching hybrid programs, and we've talked about the hybrid, what a hybrid journal is in the glossary. And these offer open access options within their existing subscription titles. And amongst these were Blackwell in 2005 and Wiley in 2006. In 2008, Springer acquires Biomed Central and becomes, at that point, the world's largest open access publisher. And the movement just begins to gather rapid pace. Over the last 10 years, the emergence of funded policies has been accommodated by development of gold OA options for researchers made available by publishers. By 2010, PLOS ONE becomes the world's largest open access journal. And PLOS ONE is significant in that it's the first broad scope journal, one that we kind of refer to now as a mega journal. 2011, Wiley launches its full gold open access program. We had hybrid programs before then. In 2011, there's a full gold program. Since then, the pace has accelerated further. Publishers have been adapting and adopting models to the changing conditions. And most recently, we have one of the more recent evolutions of this, which is the read and publish agreements. And I'll talk about those in the context of Wiley Project Deal in a later slide. So as we see, over the past 3 years, the pace continues and continues with funders and institutions and publishers all contributing to the discussions. And in 2019, we become the first publisher to sign with Project Deal. So broadly speaking, current governmental open access policies can be summarized in this slide. And we can see that there isn't one model for every country. We can see that gold open access policies tend to be a Western European phenomena. In the US, it's largely mandated green, with other territories still interested in green and others, of course, that are as of yet unspecified. I think what we're seeing here is that the whole global community isn't ready to support a gold open access, but what we do see is they are ready to support an open access model in some way or another. So the trend towards open access is unmistakable. It's here to stay, and the momentum seems to be gathering. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the Wiley Project Deal Agreement. It's significant in that it provides virtually nationwide coverage for both journal access and article processing fees in Germany. It also demonstrates a great example of change in publishing models. We have a model that went from subscription-based models to hybrid models, and now this latest evolution, which is the publish and read model. So the Wiley Project Deal Agreement was announced at the start of 2019, and in the interests of transparency, the contract is publicly available for everyone to see. So the publish and read model, what does it actually mean? Well, publish and read is a license model that encompasses both subscriptions and funding for open access holistically as one package, if you will. For researchers, it's very advantageous as it improves the ability to access content they need. There's no traditional paywall, and also enables authors to publish articles openly without the traditional administrative burden of article processing charges. So in terms of access, all eligible institutions in the Wiley Project Deal Agreement have access to around 1,700 Wiley journals, and they have access to that content all the way back to 1997. And the financial transactions for all of the publish and read services, so that's for them to access the journals and then researchers to have their APCs paid for, is undertaken directly, transactionally between Wiley and Max Planck Digital Library Services. If authors want to publish in, say, a gold journal, not a hybrid journal, then there is a usual consortia with discount option here. So it's the list fee of APCs with a 20% discount. So how do German authors, how are they eligible for that? Well, they must publish a certain types of articles. It must be a primary research article or a review article. They must be affiliated with an eligible institution, and they must also state their affiliation when submitting the article. There's also a requirement that they choose a Creative Commons license in that, the CC BY, if available. And of course, this is all in the interest of openness. So the article needs to be published in an open access journal, be that a hybrid journal or a gold open access article journal, sorry. What it means in practice. So almost 900 German institutions are eligible and over 400 have signed up. And these institutions are actually responsible for 98% of Wiley's publishing output from Germany. In addition, there are partnership activities with Project Deal, including the launch of a new interdisciplinary open access journal, outreach and an early career researcher conference, and the development of a group looking closely at the future of scholarly communication. So alongside this agreement, which I think is significant, is that as publishers, we need to develop new workflows, and we've developed new workflows that help authors get access to this and get their transactions completed for these new APC models. And there have been some author responses and testaments to the ease of publication, which we can see on this slide. And the results, as you can see from here, being overwhelmingly positive. I'll leave that there for a second for people to digest. I think most of these are from Twitter. So, in summary, I know it's a short and very fast presentation, but I hope it's given you some interesting things to think about in terms of your own publication environment, and perhaps together with a better understanding of open research and open access and transitional agreements. And also what it may mean for you as researchers and readers of content. I think to summarize, we're in the midst of a rapidly evolving publishing landscape, and it's one that I think has clear rewards for the entire research ecosystem. It's an extremely exciting time. I've included some links here if anyone is interested in delving into these developments in further detail. But with that, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to talk. Please stay safe and open the floor to any questions.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Paul. So now I was going to see if either Emiliano or Orla have any comments or thoughts that they would like to make on your presentation.
I think I'll come back to some of those elements during my presentation, so I'm not entirely sure I have anything to add. I found that super interesting, especially the figures that you provided, because I think that's part of what we need to know a little bit more of.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a lot to present in 15 minutes, so I hope we managed to get through everything.
Yeah, I think it is interesting too, and some of the things I have to say are very much linked.
Great.
Okay then, great. Then I would suggest that we move on to Emiliano, if you would like to just move on to your.
Absolutely. So I will share my screen. So So thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. Sorry, I'm going back to the start. We had an interesting discussion last week when we tried to organize this, and it is true that Orla and myself were a little bit wondering what exactly we as editors can contribute to this, provided that we're not part of those who take those decisions. I'll come back to that in a minute. As sitting editors of existing journals, we don't make the decisions as to whether a journal is open access, whether research is open access. We just conform to pre-existing norms that are decided by the owners of the journal or the publishing house, and so on and so forth. So this is the main reason is that this is mostly a process that is driven by external elements. So to some extent, I think this is very clear from Paul's presentation. This is driven by technological change. I think also very much a changing scientific culture, and it's true that PLOS embodies a little bit this cultural change, or is one of its main markers since its creation in 2000, and other journals have emerged since with similar aims and similar policies. And this has had consequences, I think, and I think that's the single most important point probably for the policies of funders, right? So the European Union has been very critical here, but this has also influenced the way the owners of big journals, and especially large professional associations like EJPR, like to think about this. But again, all of this is outside the scope of our work as editors, I think, and we're not directly confronted with that. We're confronted, however, with the consequences of those different trends, and we've had to adapt. And there's a couple of very clear consequences or measurable and visible consequences that have changed our workflow. The first is that there is all journals have now, all I know of at least, have switched to online management platforms. This might sound like a tiny little element here, but I think it's pretty important because it has profoundly changed the way we work. It has basically forced us to clarify or make more explicit our procedures, which is part of what open access requires: greater accountability, greater replicability. This has also led us to create norms with regard to our professional workflow, make us more professional, and it's true that most of the journals I'm aware of work with permanent editorial assistants to make sure that the procedure is stable and over time, and that people can be held accountable for the process. And the ultimate and most important point here is that there is due to this convergence between technological change and cultural change, there is an ever greater demand for transparency, for replicability, so open data, as Paul called it. And there is a couple of other things, which is also with regard, all of this has made more visible possible biases in the process, right? So, and that's part of something that we as journal editors have to address, and have been trying to address. So I'll focus my presentation on three little points here. The first is replicability, then diversity, and then I'll say something about how social media play into this, because I think this is part of what has really changed our everyday work. So as a journal, EJPR has been confronted especially with the issue of replicability, and we're a latecomer here. For a long time, we did not require authors to upload their code or their data, and it's true that we're still struggling a little bit with this. We have created new norms, actually starting last year. There was an EJPR wide norm saying that authors were expected to upload their data, but it's true that as long as we did not really enforce this, nothing much had happened. So we have together with Wiley and Scholar One, we have now created that structure, and I think it's an important thing, but we're still figuring out, because we're not actually replicating ourselves. Those things like EJPS and APSR have done it for a couple of years, simply because we don't have the means to do so. And yet we know that even the little thing that we're doing here, just asking authors to upload their data and code, makes research better, where there is a very interesting test by one of the editors, paper by one of the editors of EPS, another ECPR journal, Daniel Stockermeyer, that has run a test on 150 papers of 3 different journals, showing that those papers which have not uploaded the papers in journals which don't require you to do so prove more often wrong than when papers are supposed to do so. So basically, they replicated the papers where they could, and in some cases they even couldn't get access to the data at all, which is highly problematic, even after writing to the authors. But again, even for us, this is not straightforward. There's certain. I think of a paper that we have recently published, which has had access to data that is not completely public. The paper is absolutely fascinating, but at the same time, the authors could not make that data available. So we've written that into the data section of this particular paper. But again, I think some of the issues related to this open data culture are still not entirely clear to me, and we're probably still on a learning curve here. Another issue where we have invested quite a bit of time and resources is diversity. So that we've not done that on our own. ECPR has had a work plan, especially with regard to gender equality in ECPR and with regard to publications. And one of the most visible effect of this was that, well, to give you an anecdote on this, when I started a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, we were 2 male editors. Now there is 2 female editors and me, and it's true for most of the other publications, which are now more or less equally led by men and women. And I know that ECPR is taking care also about of how the responsibility for working groups, summer schools, and so on and so forth are being governed. Now, there is a growing attention to those biases in the profession. There's been quite a bit of publications in political science over the past few years, especially by Catherine Talon and a couple of other people, showing that there is strong biases with regard to publication patterns that are disfavorable to women. And it's true that as a consequence of that, several of the professional journals, and EPS has done that recently for the ECPR publications, have published long-term data of publication patterns and acceptation patterns and reviewer patterns with regard to man-women inequality or equality, and because we believe that this does have a consequence. So the paper that I actually authored on EJPR shows that there is no clear pattern, but that we do that there is no discrimination or bias at our level, at the level of the journal, but that we do reproduce the biases that exist in the profession. So basically, we get a lot less submissions by women. There is less women reviewers, and that basically mirrors what's going on elsewhere in the profession. And I think as a journal, it becomes very clear, and we're more exposed if we don't address those issues, if we don't take into account that those biases exist, and if we're not very clear about our strategy to address them. So I think that's part of how open access and technological change has clearly affected our work. I want to come back to one last element, which I think is a major issue in these days, and it's true that especially during conferences, there's a lot of social media attention, and people are bombarded with social media messages, but they also pay a lot more attention during conferences to what is going on social media. I think over the past 4 or 5 days, I think the Twitter handle of EJPR has got something like 100 to 150 new followers because we've been publishing more, because more people have been mentioning EJPR. Why does this matter really? And I think this is part of that's a part of Paul's presentation that I probably found most interesting. I think generally the landscape is changing, and I think Paul's figures were pretty explicit about this. So there is almost a doubling of the number of journals over the past, I can't remember if it was 20 years or something, and over the same time you had an increase of almost 30% or more of the number of papers published, right? So in this particular context, I think journals are suffering a little bit the same evolution as TV channels, something that my kids, for instance, they don't even know what it means, a TV channel anymore, or broadcasting network. So basically people are aware of papers, but they're not necessarily aware of where those papers are published, right? So, and they don't no longer read a journal, they read papers, right? So there's the connection between papers and the journal still exists, because we, for instance, as a journal, we have a community of authors. We have a community, we have a community of authors. We have a community of reviewers. But it is true that we don't expect, we cannot expect any longer for anybody to take up EJPR and to read it from the first to the last page. The main reason for this is that EJPR doesn't even exist any longer in a paper version, so you can't physically do that any longer. And people are exposed to a higher number of journals and a greater number of papers. And this is, I think, where social media comes in. And when I speak about social media with regard to our academic world, I'm really speaking about Twitter, because this is where it mostly takes place. And it's true that a lot of things are going on Twitter. I must admit that I was very little active on Twitter before joining EJPR, and have since been discovering it. And it is true that especially younger scholars have made it a habit of pointing to the new papers, explaining the main arguments of papers through threads on Twitter, pointing to the work of others too when they appreciate it, and so on and so forth. And it's true that this is a quite effective way of raising attention to your paper. Probably very, and we know from studies in other disciplines. I haven't found anything in poli-sci so far, but maybe that's a call for some of the people who are listening to us, that they should work on this. But generally, the evidence out there seems to suggest that social media noise is good for citations, right? So that especially young authors who don't have an already established name, that will make people tilt, oh, see, Hans-Peter Kruse has yet again published a super interesting paper on the future of democracy. So when you're not Hans-Peter Kruse, you need probably to do a little bit more marketing work of this kind, making your results accessible to people, for instance, through social media. So most journals, I think, and this includes EJPR, are rather ill-prepared for that, because they're somehow still based on the old paper-based journal model, right? So we're now, even though we transition towards an online-only publication, the way we work is very similar still to the way Chris de Schauer worked, like when he was the head of the journal a couple of decades ago, right? I think right now we don't have specific assistance on that. So what we do is we try to push authors to do it themselves, to publish threads, to advertise their papers on social media, because this is how how you raise attention to that. We're perfectly aware that attention is a scarce good, and that it's very, very difficult to get that attention. So the more you invest into this online media promotion of your own publications, the more you are likely to be listened to, right? So where this becomes complicated is we were speaking about biases and diversity earlier, and I only spoke about gender diversity. I didn't even mention diversity across countries, across small and large universities, across continents. So this may become a further source of bias, because from my little experience, this is not at all a scientific judgment. Academic Twitter, like most other Twitter, appears to be mostly a man of young white men who are in the academic world in particular are able to be funny and concise in English, right? So that clearly it necessarily does create biases, even though there is more and more women doing the same thing. But I think this is clearly where journals and journal editors and the teams around the journal editors could and should help and jump in and help, especially young scholars and scholars from smaller institutions or countries which do not have access to gold OA, for instance, to promote their work. And that's basically the kinds of, so these are three examples of questions about how the new open access research world affects the world of work of journal editing. I know that Orla will focus on a couple of other things here, but that's the points that I really want to raise, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the discussion afterwards if you have any. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you, Emiliano. That was really interesting. So I'm just going to see if Orla or Paul have any questions or comments they would like to make.
No, I think there are commonalities there between the two journals, and some differences too. So some of the same points come up for political psychology, but very interesting. Thank you, Emiliano.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's great. I recall a paper by Eisenbach back in 2012 where he proposed a twin-pact factor, an impact factor that is sort of measured on citations and Twitter feeds. I just wanted
okay.
Something to,
I will look at that.
Yeah.
Okay, then I will pass on over to Orla to continue this discussion.
Okay, I'll just attempt to share my screen. I have to say I'm no lover of Zoom. Okay. Share. And, sorry. Okay. Okay, so much of what I would want to say has probably been said already. I'm going to start with a brief introduction around political psychology. By way of background, I became editor-in-chief with James Liu, who is in New Zealand. At the beginning of February, I had previously been a handling editor for the previous 5 years with the journal. So I know the journal pretty well, but the editor-in-chief role brings different sight on different issues. So because we have only taken over, I thought I would just flag that we have just recently published purpose, vision and goals for our term. I'm sure people that like to submit to political psychology might want to read that. So in terms of the journals, where the journal's at, you know, my predecessors, previous editors-in-chief have established sort of that it's a good outlet, a high quality. Obviously, we don't want to preside over any slide in the quality of the papers that we're publishing. So we pay a good deal of attention to the peer review process. I'm sure many of the attendees are aware of the difficulties that have faced both social psychology, sociology and political science in terms of sort of big debates around fabrication, falsification, replication. So we're very aware of those and we want to make sure that we have processes in place that protect us and ensure that we are picking the right papers for publication, I suppose, and making sure that people get a fair crack at the whip. So perhaps slightly differently to some journals, political psychology is explicitly international. So it is linked to the International Society of Political Psychology, which despite its name for many years was very much centered in the USA, and there has in the last sort of 10 to 15 years been an increasing effort to internationalize more. So much of the membership of ISPCs would have been in the US, then as diversification involved Europe, but there's a real push in the organization to reach out to those in the global south. So the international agenda is important in terms of reach, but also we feel that we have an international readership. So in terms of digitalisation, for instance, we can see where where people are when they download the paper. So we actually get quite a lot of people from outside of Western nations downloading our papers. So we are keen to engage with authors and reviewers from the global South. And I suppose the other thing is, you know, as well as being high quality and peer reviewed, political psychology sees itself as an applied journal rather than, if you like, a fundamental or basic research journal. We want the information that's published to be useful. And even though we are engaged with these issues around replicability and, you know, concerned about fabrication and falsification, we also have a large portion of our contributors who are not quantitative scientists. So they are maybe take qualitative approaches. Sometimes we get papers that are analysis of historical documents. Sometimes we get papers that are just, I shouldn't say just, but that have no empirical component at all. There might be reviews, or there might be position pieces, or historical analysis. So there is a diversity in terms of the contributors, in terms of their background and discipline, as well as their methods. And there's a diversity in terms of international location of contributors, although truthfully, we still have an awful lot of contributors who are from the West, or so disproportionately from Anglo speaking or Western countries. So, and equally, issues of diversity also relate to issues of gender, as Emiliano said, so that those issues are live for us as well. So as we go into our term, these are things that we hope we're going to make progress on. So when we think about these issues of everyday access and digitalisation, when we were talking last week about the kind of things that, you know, affect us as we think about these things, of course, not as well as being an editor, I'm an academic. So recently I had some European success, and I've been trying to sign off on an ERC grant, and it's very interesting to see that the European Research Council now requires that in the grant agreement that all of these issues about compliance with FAIR principles are there. And I think that that is probably the end stage of many years, as has been mentioned already. This just hasn't happened. There has been many years where people have had concerns. So of course the FAIR principles are these stand for that when we publish, that our publication will be findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. So this relates not only to what we publish, but to our data. And the principles, though they were originally set up and intended as guidelines, they are now being required by many major funders. So of course that, you know, I'm talking about that now in terms of myself as an academic, but of course that really has implications for where I publish, and it has implications also when we think about how we think about where we're going to publish, and how editors need to think about issues around, for instance, whether or not we insist that, is it acceptable to insist that all authors provide their data, for instance, as a supplement to their publication? I guess the other thing is that sometimes when people thought about usefulness in the past, they were quite absorbed with impact factor. And certainly when we think about quality of journals, we often use impact factor as a shorthand. But now, as I mentor younger colleagues, I often point out to them that the impact factor is not how they're going to be judged into the future. We have now moved completely to people being evaluated in terms of their own personal citations. And of course, one of the best predictors of your citations is whether or not your paper is accessible. In fact, it's the single best predictor of whether or not your paper is well cited. So we know when we think about whether or not people are hired or promoted, I know on panels that I sit on, impact factor is no longer the thing, it's how much your work is cited. So I think it's very important that we think about, you know, can people find your work? Now, some of that, of course, is linked to social media and Twitter, but equally some of that is linked to paywalls. If people want to access your work, they need to not only be able to see it, they need to be able to access it. And that issue is writ large for us in political psychology, because many of the places where we want to reach out to and where we want to make political psychology more relevant and more present are areas in the global south where actually there can be issues around having access to journals, there can be cost barriers. And so this idea of gold access or open access is really highly attractive because it does allow people beyond sort of more affluent nations to have access to what we like to think is useful political psychology knowledge. And I suppose linked to that is all these things are tied up. So I know from our own internal statistics and statistics that Wiley provide us that download data is predictive of citations. So if I look at our most cited articles and our most downloaded articles, they're very similar lists. The papers at the top of the download charts are also at the top of the citations chart. So there's lots of things in there. And then sort of in terms of things that we try and do proactively to increase reach. At the moment we have a COVID-19 special issue where we're insisting that people write highlights, because of course instead of just the paper and the link on social media appearing, then it allows us to let people know what it is, the main applied message of the paper is. We often put together virtual issues, which of course can only happen because of digitalisation. So there are various things that we do along the way to try and increase exposure and reach that are very much to do with sort of digitalisation and access. And I guess the other thing that, as we talked last week, when thinking about these issues, I would say that really what we're seeing in terms of digitalisation is probably symptomatic, I see that spelled wrong, of wider change in how we think about research. And of course, my view is that the acronym FAIR is not accidental. It's the idea that we do need to democratise access to knowledge. We need to be fair about who gets to have access to knowledge. And of course, much of the knowledge that is produced, particularly in European nations, is produced at the expense of the taxpayer. So for many years it was being produced, or maybe produced at the expense of a charitable foundation. For many years this information was being produced, but actually people couldn't access then the outcomes of the research. So it is about a change in the wider world and allowing people to have access to information. And I think that's become increasingly important in the COVID era. We need people to have access to information. And it's also, of course, symptomatic of the idea that there is value in diversity. And again, I would come back to the idea that in political psychology that we have that, you know, we're a broad church, we take many methods, ideas that there are different knowledges to be obtained from Asian cultures and other areas other than sort of the dominant Western paradigm. So a lot of, and certainly we have concerns around how citations and the peer review process are linked to gendered dynamics, and they are things that we are hoping to explore more fully and maybe bring in some new ways of dealing with issues that might disadvantage women or those from the global south. So one of the things that we have as a challenge moving forward is because political psychology is really linked to ISPP and very much sees itself as being connected to its membership. any change that we bring into the publishing model, we want it not only to be transparent, but we want it to be acceptable to our members. So at the moment, we are thinking about these issues, and we had planned to do workshops where we would invite people in and ask them to sort of articulate the changes that they felt they needed to happen within the journal. COVID-19 is making that more difficult. But certainly I would be very keen to hear the views of the audience here if they have any ideas about how you translate transparency into a publishing model that allows for multiple methods, multiple disciplines. And certainly one of the things I have concerns around is the double-blind peer review process. I'm not convinced it is actually double-blind. My parents had a phrase, which is probably a very Irish phrase, which was, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So I do have concerns about the peer review process being free and done for free in extra time. I think some of the people's own time. I think some of the reasons that we're seeing problems about in the publication process is because the peer review process isn't valued terribly well by our employers, even if it's valued by editors. So I think there's probably some give needs to happen there. And then I suppose there's this issue that I feel that there's a tension around, and it's certainly since I've taken over as editor-in-chief, I feel there's a tension between this idea of reusable data that's required within the FAIR principle and this sort of salami slicing where you see, certainly already we've had several papers where when they've arrived, their similarity to papers published elsewhere is just too close. So I think there are ongoing issues and tensions that we need to resolve. And I think all of this is really heightened and more relevant and more important as we face into COVID, and hope that science and research provides some of the answers, because of course COVID isn't just about finding vaccines, it's also about the politics and the psychology of getting people to engage with changed behavior and accepting vaccines and accepting knowledge. So that's all I have to say today.
Well, thank you very much, Orla. That was really, really interesting. So first I wanted to see if Emiliano and Paul had any comments or questions they wanted to pose, and indeed if, now that we've had all three of them, the presentations, if the three of you had any other points you wanted to pull out and discuss before we move on to questions.
Honestly, I think it would be good to switch to question Q&R, because I think this was very complimentary. That's my feeling, and that I'd like to hear input from the people who have been listening.
So we only have one question, which is actually